Morning, Hannah. What I thought I could do today would be that I would quickly run through just the structure of an essay, the introductions, main body, paragraph, conclusions, just to kind of refresh yourself on how to complete a higher history essay, what the kind of main structure we're looking for, where you're picking up the marks, how you should be writing your sentences, etc., so that you can complete your preparation for an upcoming assessment that might take some form. So what I thought we could just do today is go through each section: introduction, main body, paragraph, conclusion, and just talk you through, and then you'll have this video for reference afterwards. So if you look at introductions, so introductions are worth 3 marks, and you must make sure that you're doing all 3 of these things. Okay, so you must make sure that you're going to explain the background, the context, and crucially here it needs to be at least 2 sentences. You need to have a line of argument in line with the question, so just judgment which must refer to the isolated factor, so I'll explain what that means when we see it in practice, and then include the other factors, so your other remaining paragraphs that you're going to discuss in this main body essay. So let's have a look at this question then, for an introduction that I've written here. So the question that we've got is, to what extent was the Enlightenment the main reason for the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789? So if we're thinking here about when it's talking about what does it mean about the isolated factor in the question, so the isolated factor in the question here is the Enlightenment. Okay, so the best way to think about that is, what does the question suppose that the answer is? And the question supposes that the Enlightenment was the main reason for the French Revolution in 1789. So if we use that structure of background, judgment, and line of background, judgment, and factors, we'll see how that fits into this perfect introduction here. So France had been governed for hundreds of years under the three-estate system. This was the legacy of medieval France. So there we go, that's one sentence of context of background. This split France into 3 sections: the clergy, nobility, and the rest of society. So that second sentence combined there gives you 1 mark. Okay, so the 2 sentences of context provides 1 mark out of 3 for the introduction. This laid the foundations for the division of society that led to the French Revolution. There are many reasons for the French Revolution, and undoubtedly the intellectual influence of the Enlightenment played an influential role. So you are making reference to the factor in the question, to what the isolated factor is. So you're saying the Enlightenment did play a role. However, the most important factor was the American Revolution. Okay, so that's what you would refer to as your line of argument. You've made a judgment on what you say is the most important reason for the French Revolution in 1789, as well as making reference to the factor that's in the question, as it influenced French civilians to want change. However, it must be acknowledged that other factors were involved, such as the crisis in 1788-89 and the financial problems of France. And that is the final factors that we will talk about in our introduction. Okay, so that gives us that 3 marks, because we've got the 2 sentence background, we've got our line of argument that makes reference to the isolated factor in the question, and we've got our remaining factors that we would discuss. Okay, so if you can follow that structure, make sure you're sticking rigidly to that structure, you should be able to get an easy 3 points, 3 marks to kick off your essay. Now, when we turn ourselves to the main body, so our main body paragraphs, this is where the marks are kind of allocated. So throughout your 4 or 3 paragraphs, there is 6 marks of knowledge available. Okay, so this knowledge needs to be accurate and relevant to the terms of the question. So what we mean here is accuracy in terms of the date, the statistic, the event, the people that you're describing, and it's relative to the terms of the question. So it helps you to understand, or helps you come to a final answer or judgment about what this question is asking you to do. Analysis worth up to 6 marks. So remember, analysis is split between formal analysis and then analysis plus, which is the other 3. So that's how we get the 6. So analysis when you're analysing the implications of the factors in your essay or expanding their relevance to the issue. So remember, what you're doing with your analysis is you're looking at your facts and you're using those facts to explain in your analysis why that helps you understand the question or come to a judgment about the question. Now, some of you have heard me speak about this concept of evaluation. Now, evaluation, it's a very high-end concept, and what I would suggest that you do is, if you're sitting here and you're very confident with your essays are sitting very close to the kind of 18 mark, then you might want to attempt evaluation. However, if you're not at that stage just now, what I would suggest you do is you keep working on the fundamentals of introduction, knowledge, analysis, and conclusion, get them the best you can, and then at one point in the future we will attempt evaluation. But I'll just quickly explain how the marks are allocated for evaluation, and then we can discuss it for those of you who want to attempt it. So evaluation is where you take your analysis one step forward and link it directly to the question in order to build a line of argument to your question of your pivotal factor. You should try to use the word in question directly, building your line of argument. So if we think back to our introduction is asking you state that you think the American Revolution is the most important reason. So what you're doing in your evaluation is you're showing why the American Revolution is the most important reason, or financial factors, or the Enlightenment, etc. This is where you're demonstrating the marker. Yes, although financial problems are important, they wouldn't have been important unless the Enlightenment had drawn attention to them. Okay, so that's what you're trying to do with your sort of evaluation. You're demonstrating why your line of argument is the most important and impacts all of the other factors within the essay. So remember, we have that structure that we use. So we're always looking for an open sentence, or 2 points of knowledge, or 2 points of analysis, and then we're moving on. Okay, so what's the structure that we use? So we have our opening sentence, we have our knowledge 1, our analysis 1, our knowledge 2, our analysis 2, our analysis plus. Okay, so we're thinking here about that OCACA structure that we use now. So if you're going to attempt evaluation, you'll have that E at the end, the OCAC E, just to bring in that evaluation, but your basic structure for higher history essay follows this format. Okay, so in the next slide, what I've done for us is I've provided it with samples of what these sections should look like to allow you to see the length of them, the certain words that are used, and the detail that it goes into. So if we take the opening sentence, so remember, an opening sentence is state what the link is between the factor and the question. Now, very, very simple. It'll be the same for almost all of your paragraphs. The suffragettes played a vital role in helping women gain the vote in 1918. So the suffragettes is your factor that you're going to write about in this one. You'll have the term played a vital role, and then the words of the questions. The questions about why did women gain the vote in 1918 and helping women gain the vote by 1980. Okay, so that's how we're always structuring our opening sentences. Right, so what do our knowledge points look like? So our knowledge points should look like a fact which helps to explain the topic of the question. Okay, so if we look here, so the WSPU suffragettes, who were led by Mrs. Pankhurst and her daughters, broke away from the NUWSS, the suffragists, in 1903 after they got frustrated over the lack of protest being met. The WSPU adopted violent tactics in order to raise the profile of women gaining the vote. Militant tactics included attacking the Prime Minister, pouring acid on golf courses, and setting boxes on fire. So if we look at this knowledge point here, why is that such a good knowledge point? Because we've got this idea of like, well, you're showing to the marker, you know who this is because you've got your date, 1903. You're saying it's relative to the question because the question's asking, well, how did they help women get the vote? So you're talking about the tactics that the suffragettes used to get the vote. So adopted tactics in order to help raise the profile of women getting the vote, and then you're giving an example of the militant tactics they used, attacking the Prime Minister, pouring acid on golf courses. Okay, so it's a very detailed knowledge point that you have there that would easily pick up the knowledge point in the higher history essay. So how's our analysis fit in with that then? Explain why this fact results in the events of the question. So this is important because, remember, this is our key term that we're always going to use when we're going to start our analysis, because you're demonstrating to the marker, I'm going to analyse now, so it's very easy for them to pick it up. So this is important because it gave huge amounts of publicity for the cause, as the WSPU were in daily papers constantly. This kept the issue of votes women at the top of the political agenda, which meant that politicians deciding on the issue could not always ignore it, therefore resulting in some women gaining the vote in 1980. Okay, so it's important. Why is it important? Because it's raising the profile of the actions of women's suffrage, and as a result, the government can no longer ignore it. So you're explaining why the knowledge point that you've just put down was important for women getting the vote in 1918. The final part is you're always relating it back to the question, therefore resulting, and then use the words of the question, in some women getting the vote in 1980. Now, so what we're doing here with Analysis Plus. So Analysis Plus is why could it be argued that the influence of this factor has been exaggerated? So what you're saying is you're not saying that the factor was not important. What you're saying is that it could be easy to over exaggerate the importance of this, and its impact that it had on the decision making to give women the vote is not as influential as what maybe some people think. In case it's almost like a counter argument that you're giving. So you're always going to start with however. The militancy increased during the suffragettes' royal period, which involved more aggressive and damaging tactics. This highlights the use of violence actually hindered women receiving the vote. So again, you're showing, well, actually the tactics of women getting the vote by the suffragettes actually prevented some women getting the vote, as they played into the hands of those against giving women the vote, because there was evidence of women acting irrationally and emotionally and highlighting to the government exactly why women should not get the vote. Okay, so that's the structure that we'll be using. These are the sort of, when you're preparing any sort of future essays on these topics, be looking at these, look at the length, the detail that it goes into, the certain terms that it uses to relate it back to the question, to make sure that your essays look as similar as possible to that. Okay, so what I've done here on the next slide is I've just put it all together so you can kind of see the length of it, when it sticks together and how it flows. Also here, beginning from overall, is the evaluation that I was talking about. So for those of you who are taking evaluation, I'll just read it out to you and I'll explain what it's doing. So overall, the suffragettes was important because it created much needed publicity for the cause. However, the suffragettes were not as important as the suffragists. So this particular paragraph in essay is arguing that suffragists was the most important reason for women getting the vote. So what they're going to do is we're going to relate the suffragists to the suffragettes and how the suffragists were actually more important. As a reason why women get the vote, as they were able to gain more credibility through Parliament, who would listen to them, as shown in the 1910 attempt to gain votes through Parliament. But the suffragettes' violent tactics turned Parliament against the idea of votes for women, as seen in the 1912 attempt, which failed at its second reading in Parliament, largely due to the violence of the suffragettes. Overall, the suffragists were a pivotal factor because if the stereotypical view had not been broken previously, Parliament would be unwilling to accept the bills. So what it's saying is that the suffragists are the ones who are getting the acts of Parliament into government to be spoken about. And it's actually the negative aspect of the suffragettes and their violence, which then prevents it from progressing through Parliament, as seen in 1912 when the bill to give women the vote is withdrawn from Parliament. Okay, so when you're looking for your evaluation, if you're attempting it, you're wanting to make your overall what your factor's about, then say it's not as important as what your line of argument is. You're going to explain why your line of argument factor, if it's a suffragist in this case, is more important than suffragettes, and provide a new knowledge point. Okay, that's the crucial point here. This new knowledge point, 1912 attempt, largely failed, and relate that to the two factors that you're discussing. Okay, so the final aspect in your high history essay is your conclusion. Now, I know a couple of people are struggling with conclusion, so I hope that providing me talking through the structure and then providing you with the sample answer will help for you to see how you form a conclusion. And remember though, with a conclusion, you're not providing any new pieces of information. You're just restating the information that you've already used in your essay in a form, in a structure that allows you to pick up the marks. Okay, so a conclusion, again, like an introduction, is also at 3 marks. So if you follow this structure, this will allow you to pick up 3 marks. So restate your line of argument. So overall, it's clear that the American Revolution was the most important reason why the French Revolution broke out in 1789. Overall, it's clear that suffragists was the most important reason why some women going to vote in 1980. Okay, this is because, so what you would do here is you would pick out one of your analysis points for that factor. So this is because the actions of the suffragists and lobbying MPs changed many members of the government's idea of how women can be trusted with the vote, etc. While factor 2 also contributed, so you would take your second factor you've written in the essay, write down your analysis point, although it was not important as the line of argument, because, so why was it not as important as the suffragists? Why was it not as important as the American Revolution? Because. While factor 3 also contributed, so you take your next paragraph, say why, it was not as important as what your line of argument was, because. While factor 4 also contributed, it was not as important as the line of argument, because. Okay, so what you're doing is essentially taking your analysis point from one of your factors, and then you're just saying why it wasn't as important as the factor that you've discussed throughout your full essay as being the most important. Okay, then you just make a closing statement. So therefore, whatever your line of argument is, was the most important reason why some women got the vote in 1918, why the French Revolution outbroke in 1789. Okay, so what I've given here is a sample answer, and it follows that structure, and this would gain the 3 marks that's needed. So if we look here, overall, it's clear that the actions of the suffragettes were the main reason why women won the vote in 1918. This is because, as it put the issue on the political agenda and kept it there by making politicians had urgency in dealing with their tactics, and arguably the case of votes for women had been won before the war due to the repressive tactic keeping the issue of votes for women alive. So overall, clear the suffragettes were the main reason. So that's your judgment. And then why, you've given a reason why that you would have already explained in your essay. Then you're going to take your factor 2. So the factor 2 here is about the effect of the First World War. The First World War was quite important because it was a catalyst for the decision to give women the vote. However, saying that their war work, so then you're going to see why it wasn't important. However, saying that their war work gave them the right to vote is too simplistic. It's a less important factor than suffrage campaigns because the issue of votes would have never been highlighted that the campaigns and the war allowed the campaign more credibility. Okay, so why the war is important, but why suffragettes actually are more important than the war. The changing in social economic status of women also was a major reason because it was necessary to help the political change which followed. However, it was not as important as this campaign of suffragettes because they helped highlight the change in women's social and economic status that entitled them the right to vote. The campaigns of the suffragists were of great importance because their peaceful campaign gave it credibility amongst politicians. However, they are less important than the suffragettes because they did not have the same impact by keeping the issue in the headlines. Therefore, the suffragettes were the main reason why some women gained the vote in 1918. Okay, so very much following that structure. Remember, you're not writing anything new. You're just taking your analysis marks that your analysis points that you've already explained throughout your essay, and you're just following that structure and fitting it in there. And if you can do that, you'll be able to gain 3 marks. Okay, so I hope that this has been helpful. Remember this week what your task is to choose 2 questions that I've written up on the Google Classroom. Ideally, you would want to choose one from the French Revolution and the Women in the Vote essay and submit them to me by next Monday. But what I would suggest that you do, if you can, try and write them in the 45 minutes. So spend that 45 minutes that you would in the normal sort of time conditions and see if you can write them up for me. If you need a bit longer, that's fine, but just try and replicate that as much as you can so you can see how much extra preparation you might need to do for future assessment. Do you need extra? Do you need to prepare a bit more? How's your knowledge marks? Have you committed them to memory, etc.? Okay, so if you've got any further questions, just please let me know. And just send me a message on the Google Classroom. I'll get back to you as soon as possible. But I hope that this has been helpful for you today. And best of luck.